There are stories so dark, so unnervingly real, that they cling to the mind long after the final word is read. They creep into the quiet moments, into the stillness of night when the world is asleep and shadows stretch across the walls, and remind us that evil is not a myth. It breathes. It walks. It hides behind human eyes. Among these stories, one name rises like a cold whisper from the depths of America's darkest nightmares: Jeffrey Dahmer. To speak his name is to summon an atmosphere of dread, a chilling awareness that the face of true horror once lived quietly among ordinary people, unnoticed, undisturbed, and unimagined. His life is a descent into psychological ruin, a slow unmasking of a monster who learned early how to smile at the world while feeding a darkness no one suspected. Jeffrey Dahmer's story is not just a recounting of crimes. It is an encounter with a kind of evil that wears normalcy like a second skin. It is the kind of tale that makes you question the people you pass every day, the strangers who walk behind you at night, the neighbors who greet you politely in the hallway. If someone like Dahmer could exist without detection, who else could be hiding behind quiet eyes? His life invites not understanding but dread, not curiosity but caution. It reminds us that monsters do not always leap from the shadows. Sometimes they approach softly, speaking gently, smiling faintly. And by the time you realize what they are, it is already far too late. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21st, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. His childhood, at first glance, was not the breeding ground of nightmares. He lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind where families believed the world outside their door was safe. But within the young boy grew a stillness that unsettled even his parents. He was quiet, too quiet for a child. His gaze lingered too long on things other children ignored. He seemed to drift through his early years in a fog, watching life from behind an invisible barrier. While other children played, laughed, and chased each other through the yard, Dahmer retreated into the woods behind his home. There, he developed an eerie fascination with what remained after life ended. He collected the bones of small animals, handling them with strange reverence, listening to the hollow click of skeletons as though they were whispering secrets only he could hear. What for others would be simple disgust or fear was, for him, a quiet thrill. And like all things that thrill, it bloomed into obsession. His father would later recall that Dahmer seemed particularly interested in the way bodies fit together, and more disturbingly, how they came apart. It was a curiosity no one thought to nurture responsibly, or extinguish before it grew into something far more dangerous. Adults often dismiss the signs. They told themselves he was just peculiar, just lonely, just going through a phase. But the truth simmering beneath those early behaviors was far darker. It was the beginning of a hunger that would one day devour him entirely. Adolescence did not soften Dahmer's strangeness, it deepened it. He grew increasingly withdrawn, hiding behind a mask of awkward humor and alcohol. By high school, he drank excessively, sometimes even in class, tried to drown out the fantasies that clawed at the edges of his mind. His classmates found him amusing at times, imitating him as a sort of bizarre joke. But behind their laughter was discomfort, a sense that there was something profoundly wrong with a boy who seemed both present and absent at once. He participated in the world but did not belong to it. The darkness blossoming inside him finally erupted in 1978, when he committed his first murder at the age of 18. It happened almost impulsively, a sudden break in his thin tether to restraint. But once done, it awakened something he could never push down again. He felt both horrified and relieved. The act fulfilled the fantasies he had carried for years, and the relief of that temporary quiet in his mind enchanted him. Darkness, once fed, only grows hungrier. For nearly a decade after that first killing, Dahmer lived a life of drift, moving between states, losing jobs, sinking deeper into alcoholism, drowning in loneliness. But beneath that instability, the monster within him sharpened its teeth. His mind teetered between craving connection and fearing it, between longing for companionship and destroying it. And each time loneliness pressed its weight against his chest, the darkness whispered to him, promising a twisted form of control, of possession, of stillness. By the mid-1980s, Dahmer had begun regularly luring men back to the places he lived. First a grandmother's house, later his own apartment. The method was simple and chilling. He approached individuals who lived on society's fringes, those whose absence would not raise immediate alarm. He charmed them softly, offering companionship or money. His voice was gentle, unthreatening, the kind of tone that lowered defenses. But once they stepped inside his domain, the tone changed, internally, if not outwardly. Behind the closed door, Dahmer allowed the darkness complete control. His apartment became a place where nightmares hardened into reality. The blinds stayed closed. The air grew stale with chemicals. Objects no one should ever keep were tucked neatly away, each one a trophy of horror. Neighbors would later describe the smell, a sour, chemical heaviness that seeped through the walls. But whenever they asked, Dahmer answered with soft excuses. Spoiled meat, a freezer problem, fish that had died. His calm explanations soothed their suspicions. After all, he looked harmless, polite, ordinary. Who could imagine that such a quiet man was preserving pieces of human lives behind his locked bedroom door? What made Dahmer uniquely terrifying was not the violence of his acts, but the cold steadiness of them. He was not frenzied. He did not rage. Instead, he planned meticulously. He controlled every detail. His victims entered his apartment alive and hopeful, unaware that they had stepped into a quiet abyss. Dahmer watched them with a detached curiosity, studying them as if they were objects rather than people. He wanted them close, wanted them silent, wanted them still. What occurred in that apartment was the full expression of the darkness he had carried since childhood. Several times, his crimes could have been stopped. Several times, police unknowingly stood only feet away from the evidence of unimaginable horror. In one infamous instance, a young man, barely conscious, terrified, wandered into the street and encountered officers. Neighbors begged him to intervene, but Dahmer, calm and trembling just enough to seem vulnerable rather than dangerous, convinced the police that the boy was his partner, that everything was fine, that they had simply had a disagreement, and the officers believed him. They returned the victim to Dahmer. Minutes later, the boy was gone forever. It was the ultimate demonstration of Dahmer's terrifying disguise, a mask of quiet politeness that hid a monster more effectively than any shadow could. By 1991, his inner world had rotted completely. His apartment became a collection of horrors. He kept photographs, mementos, and objects that testified to the depth of his depravity. Someone entering that apartment would immediately feel something was wrong. The air itself felt heavy, as if saturated with suffering. The walls seemed to echo with silence, the kind of silence that comes after unimaginable screams. Everything ended when one victim managed to escape. Panic-stricken, he ran into the street and flagged down police. This time, the officers listened. When they entered Dahmer's apartment, they expected drugs or perhaps a dispute. They did not expect to step into a nightmare. Their flashlights illuminated images and remains that froze them where they stood. The realization struck like a blow. They were standing inside the lair of a serial killer whose actions defied comprehension. The news spread swiftly, and the world reacted with wide-eyed horror. People struggled to understand how a man who looked so ordinary could commit such monstrous acts. The face they saw on television did not resemble their idea of evil. Dahmer did not sneer or shout or revel in violence. He looked empty, quiet, hollow, chillingly calm. In interviews, he spoke about his crimes with a detachment that made even seasoned investigators shudder. He described his impulses as though discussing someone else's life, someone else's darkness. But the darkness was entirely his own. During his trial, Dahmer's voice stayed soft. He apologized, but the words felt strangely flat, as though spoken from an emotional void. Psychologists dissected his mind, but the answers they sought dissolved into the same troubling enigma. How could man so calm, so ordinary in appearance, be capable of such horrors? What organ of the brain houses evil? And is it possible for someone to appear so normal while carrying a mind so catastrophically broken? Even in prison, Dahmer's presence disturbed those around him. He was not loud or aggressive. He simply existed with a quietness that unsettled the inmates and guards alike. His calmness felt unnatural, as though the darkness within him still stirred quietly, just beneath the surface. Some inmates avoided him. Others were repulsed or enraged by him. Eventually, rage found him. In 1994, a fellow inmate took his life. Some believed it to be karma, others a final act of justice. But Dahmer's death did not end the fear that bore his name. Evil like his does not disappear with the body. It lingers in the collective memory, a permanent stain on the landscape of human history. Jeffrey Dahmer remains one of the most chilling reminders that true horror is not always loud or obvious. Sometimes it is soft-spoken. Sometimes it stands quietly in a corner, hands folded, eyes lowered, waiting for the world to look away long enough for darkness to act. His story forces us to confront the frightening truth that the worst monsters are not born in the shadows. They grow in plain sight, unnoticed, ignored, dismissed until their darkness finally erupts. And so his legacy endures, a warning whispered through time. Trust your instinct about the quiet ones, the odd ones, the ones who smile without their eyes. Because Jeffrey Dahmer once stood among ordinary people, appearing harmless, gentle, invisible. But behind his calm voice lived a nightmare so profound that the world is still trying to wake from it. Even after Jeffrey Dahmer's death, the echo of his crimes refused to fade. Investigators, journalists, and psychologists continue to sift through the ashes of his life, searching for the one missing piece, the moment where everything could have changed. But there was no single moment, no simple explanation. Dahmer's darkness had seeped into the cracks of his existence like a slow-moving poison, unnoticed until it consumed him entirely. The more the world examined his past, the clearer it became that the most terrifying part of his legacy wasn't the acts themselves, but the silence surrounding them. The neighbors who smelled the rot, but accepted the excuses. The police who stood at the edge of horror, but turned away. The family who saw the unraveling, but didn't understand the depth of it. Dahmer didn't hide his darkness. It simply went unseen. And that is where the real fear begins. Long after his arrest, people continued to visit his apartment building, hoping for a glimpse of the place where nightmares took shape. They stopped at the doorway, imagining what it must have felt like to stand in the very room where innocence ended for so many. But the building, unable to escape the weight of its history, was eventually demolished. Today it is an empty lot, quiet, ordinary, deceptively peaceful. Children play nearby. Cars pass without slowing. The wind blows across the grass as if the land itself is relieved to be free of what once stood there. Still, the story clings to the air around it. Some passers-by swear the place feels colder. Others say the silence is too heavy, too unnatural. Whether haunted by spirits or by memory, the ground remains a dark reminder of the evil that once lived there. Dahmer's apartment may be gone, but the ghost of his crimes lingers in the collective psyche of anyone who has ever dared to learn the truth. Even now, decades later, people remain captivated by the paradox of his existence. How could someone so soft-spoken commit acts that defy imagination? How could a single person carry so much darkness behind such quiet eyes? And the most chilling question of all, could someone like Dahmer exist today, unnoticed, waiting in the shadows of another city, another building, another lonely life? These questions keep us awake. They force us to look into the mirror of humanity and confront our fragile assumptions about what evil looks like, because it does not always come snarling or raging. Sometimes it comes in the form of a polite neighbor, a quiet coworker, a stranger who smiles. If you find yourself haunted by stories like this, by the mysteries of human darkness, by the psychology of killers, by the cases that still leave experts speechless, then you're exactly the kind of person who needs to join People's Crimes on YouTube. It's a channel where real stories of real monsters are told with chilling detail, powerful research, and breathtaking suspense. If Dahmer's shadow intrigues you, imagine what other cases will do. Subscribe to People's Crimes, where every story pulls you deeper, every episode uncovers another truth, and the darkness is always one click away.